Welcome to the Royal Road School of Carmelite Prayer. St. Teresa of Avila tells us that the divine path of Carmelite or silent prayer is the royal road to heaven, and that those who travel it will be given a great treasure. A link to the Praying with Teresa of Avila website has been provided below to enable you to easily find the Catalogue of Offerings on this channel, along with the notes, PowerPoint, and audio of today's presentation, Spiritual Betrothal, by Father Marie-Eugène. The website provides all the simple tools that you need to develop your own practice of Carmelite or silent prayer, along with complete course materials to start your own school of prayer in your parish or in your community. Spiritual Betrothal, Chapter 7, taken from I Am a Daughter of the Church, Blessed Father Marie-Eugène. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. John 14. On approaching the summit of the spiritual life, St. Teresa does not leave off calling on God for help. But even at these heights, she thought herself incapable of putting into words her experience. And yet the masters of Carmel cause a simple and clear light to shine on these summits. To perfect fidelity in love, God answers with perfect love, taking complete possession of the soul, which becomes his dwelling place, having its perfect realization in spiritual marriage. Spiritual betrothal and marriage are the symbolism used by St. Teresa to describe the two stages distinguished on the summits. It is called union of love with love, and its operations is entirely pure and so delicate and gentle that there is no way of describing them. But the Lord can make the soul very deeply conscious of them. Spiritual betrothal and spiritual marriage will show us the divine manifestations in their highest developments and the contemplative light in its full brightness in transforming union. Spiritual betrothal. In what does spiritual betrothal consist? To this question, Teresa answers, and now you are going to see what His Majesty does to confirm this betrothal. This is what happens when he bestows raptures which carry the soul out of its senses. In the book of her life, the saint is more precise. The Lord gathers up the soul till it is right out of itself and begins to reveal to it things concerning the kingdom that he has prepared for it. In these raptures, the soul seems to no longer animate the body. No means of resistance is possible. Warding off counterfeits, Teresa and John of the Cross point out that raptures are not like swoons and trances, which are natural. Their subject returns to themselves with the first touch of pain. St. Teresa considers it important to mark the difference between the raptures of betrothal and the mystical grace of union of the fifth mansions. Speaking of union, the saint says, "It seems to me that this union is rather like what happens when two people meet. There is a discussion about whether they are suited to each other and are both in love. They shall meet together, and he shall unite her with himself. We can compare union to a short meeting. It is over in a very short time. In mystical union, there is a loss of consciousness, complete suspension of the internal and external senses. In regaining consciousness, there is a certitude of having been in God, in its own center, but of the contact itself, it can say nothing. In the meeting of the betrothal, or rapture, the soul, says St. Teresa, is not deprived of its interior senses. The soul feels itself carried away by an irresistible force. There is no loss of consciousness. The soul has never been so fully awake to the things of God, or had such knowledge of His majesty. This may seem impossible if the faculties can be described as dead and the senses are so well. How can the soul be said to understand this secret? Elsewhere, the saint says, rapture is much more beneficial than union. The effects are far more important and have more operations, for union gives the impression of being the same at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end, and it all happens interiorly. But the ends of the raptures are of a higher degree, and the effects they produce are both interior and exterior. In the rapture of transport of the betrothal, the soul not only has contact with God, but penetration into God. The darkness of union is replaced by dazzling light. The soul gazes into God, eyes open, aware of its union. It discovers profound secrets of the divine. St. Teresa writes, "You enter into a private apartment in the palace of the king. The soul becomes one with God. It is brought into this mansion, which we must have in the depths of our souls. After coming to itself, it will remember the great things it has seen. It will not be able to describe them." The powerful force that bears the soul away to these higher regions and the divine outpourings the soul is favored with there are different from the quiet produced by the spring of water or the divine spark of the fourth mansions. With tremendous force, there rises up so powerful a wave that this little ship, our soul, is lifted up on high. Again, the saint writes, he feels, a person enraptured, as if he has been in another world and has been shown a fresh light there. He is taught many things all at once. St. Teresa writes, "An imaginary vision seen with the eyes of the soul is very much more clearly seen than we can ordinarily see things with the eyes of the body. Revelations are communicated to it without words, and intellectual visions are revealed to him, in particular, a host of angels with their Lord." Extraordinary favors often accompany this higher light that accompanies this force. The first time that St. Teresa was elevated to rapture, she heard our Lord say to her, "I will have thee converse now not with me, but with angels, freeing her from all human communication. At other times during transports or raptures, she was favored with visions, intellectual or imaginary. Following spiritual betrothal, St. Teresa speaks of extraordinary graces, most numerous in this period, producing the greatest effects. They are not the essential elements of betrothal. The spiritual betrothal is marked mainly by the superior quality of the union and the light in which it is concluded. St. Teresa explains that there is no essential difference between the mansion in which the transport begins and the mansion in which the perfect union of spiritual marriage takes place. The Creator himself knows the secret of what happens. She adds, these two mansions might be fused as one. There is no closed door to separate the one from the other. There are things in the latter mansion which are not shown to those who have not yet reached it. I have thought it best to separate them. Spiritual betrothal bears more resemblance to the spiritual marriage than to the mystical union of the fifth mansions. It introduces the soul into a higher state, adorning it with jewels, preparing it for perfect union. The betrothal jewels. Teresa speaks of the jewels which the spouse is beginning to give to his bride. Discovery of God in the divine union. The most precious of the betrothal jewels is certainly the Word himself as spouse, giving himself and manifesting himself in more and more frequent visits. Intimate knowledge of its divine spouse is truly the soul's most beautiful adornment, its most precious treasure, the source of all its good. Everything comes to the soul from its union with the Beloved. It is not yet spiritual marriage, but closely related to it, and there is no closed door between these two mansions. Spiritual betrothal are visits in which manifestation and union are experienced at the same time. They are a union between God and the soul in light. The soul becomes one with God. Manifestation is the effect of union, and spiritual betrothal is a touch of God in the soul. Although this touch is as unifying as spiritual marriage, it is only a touch. Betrothal then introduces the soul into a new state, which is already unitive. It has received a promise of perfect union. This promise is one of the betrothal jewels, perhaps the most precious one. Exchange of promises and mutual fidelity. Essentially, the spiritual betrothal is a promise of marriage, mutually exchanged. God affirms his choice by renewed visits. His hold on the soul becomes progressively more powerful. St. Teresa says God is taking the soul to himself, as she is his own property and has now become his bride. He will not allow her to be disturbed either by the faculties or by the senses. The door of the mansion in which he dwells remains open so that we may enter. After spiritual betrothal, the soul derives a firmness rendering it almost invulnerable, terrible to the devil. Among God's gifts to it there is not only light or a new attitude, but an efficacious strength for action. The soul's fidelity is now unfailing. Its gift of self is perfect. The soul desires that complete solitude in which it finds the repose of and torment of love. During spiritual betrothal, love is already fruitful, comprising domination by God and union with Him. In this period, Saint Teresa established her reform and founded several monasteries. In the works produced by the soul, God sees only the faithfulness and love to which they testify. God has been attracted by the perfume of love arising from good works. He is conquered by the soul's silent and ardent gaze. This twofold fidelity of love and faith assures the soul's victory over God. If it is to become the perfect dwelling place of God, the soul, having been purified and adorned, must be dilated and enlarged in proportion to the gift it is to receive. Anguish and great desires are to effect this final preparation. It is the last jewel of the betrothal. Ardent desires and anguish. After the grace of mystical union of the fifth mansions, the soul was bewildered by the newness of the regions in which it found itself. Saint Teresa speaks at length about the restlessness of the poor little butterfly. The agitation and restlessness can be explained by the complete obscurity in which the union took place in that mystical grace. The discovery of the spouse in the light of the spiritual betrothal dispels the darkness and brings comforting peace to the soul. This deep peace is only temporary, for the peace of satiation might well extinguish the soul's desires. For the ascent, it is not yet at the summit. God rekindles the flame of great desires, creating new anguish in the soul. A strange torment, but one which marks a happy development of the grace of the betrothal and announces that perfect union is near. The soul no longer wants anything but God and will brook no obstacles that hinder it from enjoying perfectly the beloved. At this time, God seems to visit the soul only to increase its habitual torment. Saint Teresa writes, "A martyrdom, severe, but also delectable, for the soul will accept nothing earthly offered it." These graces mark the end of the period of spiritual betrothal. Time and duration of the spiritual betrothal. So let's try and determine the time and duration of the spiritual betrothal. Time. The spiritual betrothal is the central fact of the sixth mansion. Saint Teresa, in describing the betrothal, speaks of the purifying sufferings and of the awakenings and words of God in the soul, and she shows us the ardent anguish of love, impatient before spiritual marriage. In the 3 periods that precede spiritual marriage, the first consists in preparatory mortifications. The second phase, we recognize the passive purifications of the spirit. That opens into the third phase, a period of divine visits that purify and enrich the soul. John of the Cross speaks of only 2 phases in the preparation for spiritual marriage. Spiritual betrothal inaugurates the second phase and is situated between the negative phase of preparation, mortification and purification, and the positive phase of preparation marked by divine visits. It would, however, be a mistake to separate the 2 phases into airtight compartments. The rapture of betrothal are a sign that the purification is not complete, but they bring it to an end, and happily so. The divine visits of the betrothal complete the soul's purification, preparing it in a positive way for spiritual marriage. The soul is now wholly turned to the beloved. The divine visits bring to completion the work of purification, though only perfected in perfect union, and assure God's positive action that goes on increasing until spiritual marriage. Duration of the period of betrothal. How much time is given to the positive preparation brought about through the divine visits? The betrothal is an exchange of promises preceding marriage. To determine its length, let's examine the problem more closely. In the Sixth Mansions, chapter 11, Teresa speaks of a valuable sign. She, the soul, comes to experience great distress. No limitations can be set on God's acts, and that He can raise a soul to the highest point in a single moment. Several years passed, during which her desires went on increasing under the action of the divine visits, before she experienced the anguish of love, which constitutes the immediate preparation for spiritual marriage. For Teresa, the period of betrothal began between 1558 and 1560 and concluded in November 1572 with the favor of spiritual marriage. We cannot say that it was prolonged by the saints' infidelities. Saint Teresa's life shows what extraordinary favors spiritual betrothal brings to the soul, but also the works and fruitfulness which manifest the union already realized. The example of Saint Teresa's life is important, if only one example, in view of her special mission as spiritual mother, and that is in harmony with the role of positive preparation for spiritual marriage attributed to this period of betrothal. Spiritual betrothal is then not a meeting destined to fix the condition of a union soon to be confirmed. It inaugurates a period of positive preparation that the requirements for spiritual marriage will ordinarily prolong. This period is simply one of waiting. It is already marked by favors and by a supernatural fruitfulness radiant under the light that falls from the summits. Amen.